$250,000. That was the sum the HOA threw at me, a number so outrageous it almost made me laugh. And then they added the threat that if I didn't pay, they'd drag me into court. They even promised to call the police to enforce it. And of course, the very next morning, the call came. 911. The dispatcher reported a dangerous troublemaker on his own property, right in my own yard. But what the HOA didn't realize was simple. They could write all the bylaws they wanted, post all the rules and fines in fancy fonts, but it was me standing here, guarding my home and my family's legacy. Just one calculated move, one flick of my wrist, and the entire neighborhood would understand what real silence feels like. When that moment came, the question of who controlled whom would vanish entirely. Let's rewind 3 weeks to when the nightmare truly began. I'd decided to renovate the cabin I inherited from my father, an 80-year-old lakeside retreat that had stayed in the Mitchell family since before World War II. This place wasn't just a property. It was where my dad taught me to fish, where I learned that sometimes the most meaningful conversations happen in silence, and where I planned to spend my early retirement designing sustainable architecture for small communities. The cabin rested on prime lakefront property in Pine Lakes, encircled by towering oaks, with a private dock that had withstood decades of storms, sun, and winter ice. It was perfect until Rachel Morrison arrived. She showed up at my doorstep, like a storm in a tailored suit. 52 years old, perfectly dressed in charcoal gray that probably cost more than most people's mortgages. In one hand, she carried a thick manila folder as though it were a weapon. Rachel had that presence, the kind that could stop a boardroom in its tracks without a word. Former corporate attorney, Wharton MBA, now president of the Pine Lakes Homeowners Association. She looked at me like a banker sizing up my bank account, and I could almost feel the invisible abacus in her mind ticking numbers against my worth. "Mr. Mitchell," she said without waiting for an invitation onto my porch, "we need to discuss some violations." She opened her folder, revealing pages and pages that looked more at home in a law library than a neighborhood dispute. 200 pages of HOA bylaws, regulations, and amendments, freshly updated just 6 months ago. The violations were absurd, almost comically so. My navy blue cabin, against the new aesthetic harmony guidelines, the century-old oak trees along my property line, encroaching because their branches extended just 2 feet beyond recently surveyed lot markers. The dock, my grandfather built by hand in 1952, unapproved infrastructure for lacking modern permits. Even my solar panels, which made the cabin energy independent, were deemed visually disruptive. As Rachel meticulously went through the list of crimes with the precision of a prosecutor, something clicked in my engineer's brain. When she mentioned the community surveillance system that had documented all these supposed violations, she casually revealed that the cameras were linked to our upgraded digital infrastructure. My heart skipped. 15 years ago, Mitchell Engineering had designed and installed every piece of digital infrastructure in Pine Lakes, the fiber optic network, the distributed power grid, and, yes, the security camera system. And crucially, our 10-year maintenance contract was still active, giving me legitimate access to every network in the community. The fines were astronomical: $50,000 for aesthetic violations, $75,000 in legal processing fees, $100,000 for landscape, restoration, and $25,000 in administrative penalties. When I asked her for specifics justifying these sums, Rachel smiled in a way that made my skin crawl. "These are the new community standards, Mr. Mitchell," she said, voice sharp, posture perfect. "We've had to become more aggressive to maintain property values." Aggressive. That word told me everything. This wasn't about property values, not at all. That evening, I called my wife, Maria, from the cabin's kitchen, the same place where my father had taught me to stand, up for what was right. Maria Thompson, my anchor for 12 years, trauma surgeon at Sacred Heart Hospital, with hands that had saved more lives than I could count. "David, you sound shaken." she said immediately, her intuition sharp as ever. After explaining everything, there was a pause. Then she said, "Honey, you know they picked the wrong fight, right? You literally built the foundation they're standing on." She was right. Not only had I designed their infrastructure, but before starting my own firm, I had spent 12 years with the FBI's Cybercrime Division and the NSA, specializing in tracing international money laundering through digital networks. Following digital breadcrumbs was second nature to me, better than most federal investigators. After the call, I fired up my workstation in the cabin's basement. A $250,000 extortion attempt demanded a serious response within an hour. I logged into the Pine Lakes network with my maintenance credentials. What I found made my blood run cold. The HOA wasn't merely collecting fines, they were running a surveillance operation on 47 households, storing private footage without consent, and selling resident data to marketing companies. But the real smoking gun was hidden in Rachel's email archives, dozens of encrypted messages between her and something called Pinnacle Development Group, a mysterious company with serious financial power and reach. The next morning, Rachel's ultimatum arrived, timestamped exactly 6 a.m. "Mr. Mitchell, you have 72 hours to remit payment in full, or we will initiate foreclosure proceedings. Community standards are non-negotiable. Continued resistance will increase your legal exposure." Email metadata told another story. Her message had been routed through Pinnacle Development servers, not the HOA's system. Rachel Morrison might have been the face of this operation, but someone else was pulling the strings. Sitting in my father's leather chair, staring out at the lake that had been our family sanctuary for generations, I realized this was bigger than fines, bylaws, or community standards. They had targeted the wrong person. I typed a response to Rachel. "Miss Morrison, I've reviewed your demands. Before proceeding, you should know I've conducted my own investigation into Pine Lake's digital infrastructure. We should meet. I think you'll find my findings illuminating. Sent." Then, acting with the precision only someone with my experience would, I documented everything, hashing every file, screenshot, and piece of evidence. In 71 hours, Rachel Morrison would learn she'd picked the wrong neighbor. The next morning, my engineering instincts screamed alarm. A new camera had appeared on the utility pole across from my cabin, its lens trained on my front porch. I grabbed my frequency analyzer from the basement, the same device I'd used in NSA days to detect unauthorized surveillance, and what I found was worse than I imagined. 5 cameras in total, cleverly hidden in electrical boxes, street signs, and the obvious one on the pole, all linked to the same network I'd built 15 years ago. Tracing the feeds, the encryption signatures told me this wasn't ordinary HOA equipment. These were military-grade surveillance devices, the kind used by federal agencies for long-term monitoring. And they weren't just watching me. They were observing 47 households in Pine Lakes, recording every movement, every package, every departure and return, months of continuous data, undisclosed to the residents. For the next 6 hours, I dug deeper. The surveillance network extended beyond Pine Lakes. Identical camera systems appeared in 4 other communities within a 50-mile radius. Someone was orchestrating a county-wide operation using my infrastructure. The technical sophistication required was staggering, suggesting professional expertise and serious resources. This wasn't some simple HOA overreach. This was a coordinated, highly organized intrusion that had underestimated exactly who they were dealing with. Power. Hungry HOA board making up rules. This was organized, well-funded, and completely illegal. But the real breakthrough came when I accessed Rachel's email archives through the administrative backdoor I'd built into the system years ago. Rachel Morrison wasn't the mastermind I'd initially thought. She was taking detailed orders from someone identified only as Miss K in dozens of encrypted messages. The instructions were precise and chilling. Target the Mitchell property first. Use maximum legal pressure. If resistance continues, escalate to personal consequences. There was a methodical quality to these communications that reminded me of the organized crime networks I'd helped the FBI dismantle. Each household in Pine Lakes had been assigned a priority number, with mine sitting at the top of the list. The financial records I uncovered painted an even darker picture. Rachel had indeed transferred $127,000 from the Community Maintenance Fund to her personal account. But that money didn't stay there. Within hours of each transfer, identical amounts moved to an offshore account registered to something called Lakeshore Holdings, LLC. The banking routing information led to the Cayman Islands, a classic money laundering destination. But more disturbing were the itemized expenses charged to the community fund: landscaping contracts with companies that didn't exist, security services that were never provided, and maintenance work on facilities that had never been built. I needed to understand what I was really dealing with, so I reached out to Marcus Williams, my former colleague from the FBI's Cyber Crime Division. Marcus had become a detective with the county sheriff's department after leaving federal service, and he still had connections throughout law enforcement. When I explained what I discovered, there was a long silence before he spoke. "David, you need to be very careful here. I've been hearing whispers about unusual HOA activity in this region, but every time we try to investigate, we get shut down by people with more authority than local law enforcement should have. Someone's protecting these operations, and they have serious political connections." That evening, as I was preparing to document my findings with the same forensic precision I'd learned during my federal service, something happened that confirmed my worst fears. The power to my cabin went out, not from a storm or equipment failure, but from a deliberate interruption of service. Through my window, I could see the rest of the neighborhood had full power. Someone was sending me a message, but they'd forgotten one crucial detail about the man who designed their electrical system. I had backup power, isolated internet connections, and monitoring equipment that could track exactly who'd issued the shutdown command. The system logs showed the power interruption had been initiated remotely using an administrative override that should have required utility company authorization, but the digital signature belonged to Pinnacle Development, the same company whose servers had been routing Rachel's emails. As I watched through my night vision equipment, a black limousine with tinted windows and obscured license plates pulled up to my cabin. This wasn't Rachel Morrison coming to discuss HOA violations. This was someone with the resources and connections to manipulate public utilities, coordinate multi-county surveillance networks, and make federal investigations disappear. The limousine sat there for exactly 10 minutes, long enough for whoever was inside to make their point before driving away into the darkness. But they'd made a critical error. Every second of their visit had been recorded by the very surveillance system they'd installed to watch me. The infrared cameras I'd quietly activated caught clear images of the vehicle's actual license plates, and the directional microphones I'd positioned around the property had recorded the conversations happening inside that car. As I uploaded everything to my secure cloud storage with military-grade encryption, I realized that Rachel Morrison's 72-hour ultimatum wasn't just about money or HOA violations. This was about power, control, and a conspiracy that reached far beyond one lakeside community. Tomorrow, I would find out exactly how far this rabbit hole went and why someone with serious resources wanted my family's cabin badly enough to wage war against a man who'd spent 12 years learning how to hunt down the most sophisticated criminal networks in the world. Wilson's arrival changed everything about the scope of this conflict. From the black limousine emerged a man who looked like he'd stepped out of a Fortune 500 boardroom, wearing a $10,000 suit, and the kind of confidence that comes from never being told no. He was about 60 years old, silver-haired, with the bearing of someone accustomed to being the most powerful person in any room he entered. "Mr. Mitchell," he said, extending a hand that felt like a politician's handshake. "Calculated and insincere. You can call me Wilson. I represent certain interests that have a stake in this community's future." The way he said certain interests made it clear that Rachel Morrison was just middle management in whatever organization had decided my cabin needed to disappear. Wilson knew things about my life that should have been impossible for a stranger to access. He mentioned Maria's surgical schedule at Sacred Heart Hospital, down to which operating rooms she'd be working in next week. He referenced the Bitcoin portfolio I'd built up during my consulting years after leaving federal service. Investments I'd never discussed with anyone except my accountant. He even knew about the secure communication system I'd installed in the cabin's basement, equipment that wasn't listed on any public records. Information is a powerful currency, Mr. Mitchell, he said with a smile that never reached his eyes. And in today's connected world, privacy is really just an illusion for people who don't understand how networks actually function. His offer was simple and terrifying in its implications. $500,000 cash deposited into any account I specified in exchange for voluntarily signing over the cabin to Pine Lakes community within 48 hours. The alternative, he suggested with the casual tone someone might use to discuss the weather, was that unfortunate incidents have a way of affecting the people we care about most. When I asked what kind of incidents he meant, Wilson pulled out his phone and showed me photographs of Maria leaving the hospital the previous evening, walking to her car alone in the poorly lit parking garage. The message was unmistakable, and it filled me with a cold rage I hadn't felt since my FBI days when we'd been hunting international criminals who threatened innocent families. But Wilson made a critical error that revealed more than he intended. While describing how stubborn property owners often faced unexpected difficulties, he mentioned details about my father's death 5 years earlier that had never been made public. According to official records, Dad died of a heart attack while working in the cabin's workshop. But Wilson knew about the specific tools Dad had been using, the exact time of day it happened, and even the position his body had been found in. Your father was a good man, Mr. Mitchell, but he had some very strong opinions about preserving family land. Sometimes strong opinions can be dangerous for a person's health. The casual way he delivered what amounted to a confession of murder told me that my father hadn't died of natural causes. He'd been eliminated because he'd refused to give up the cabin. 20 minutes after Wilson left, my phone rang with the call I'd been dreading. Maria's voice was shaky. Nothing like the steady confidence she maintained in the operating room. David, something's wrong with my car. I was driving home from my shift when the traffic light system went haywire. 3 intersections in a row showed green in all directions simultaneously, and I barely avoided 2 accidents before pulling over. The timing was too perfect to be coincidental. Wilson had just finished threatening my wife, and now she was experiencing exactly the kind of unfortunate incident he described. The traffic control system was part of the same network infrastructure I designed 15 years ago, which meant someone with administrative access was using it as a weapon. While Maria dealt with the police report and the city's traffic department, I made a connection that changed everything about how I viewed this situation. Jim Patterson, my neighbor who'd lost his cabin to HOA foreclosure the previous year, appeared at my back door after dark, looking nervously over his shoulder like he expected to be followed. "David," he said quietly, "there's something you need to know about what happened to my family, and it's going to sound crazy, but I think you're the only person who might believe me." Jim had been my roommate during our junior year at State University, back when we'd both thought we'd spend our lives designing bridges and buildings instead of fighting shadowy conspiracies. Jim's story was a blueprint for exactly what they were trying to do to me. It had started with manufactured HOA violations, escalated to impossible fines, and culminated in forced foreclosure when he couldn't pay the $180,000 they demanded. But the real horror was what happened to his family afterward. His wife had lost her job at the local bank under mysterious circumstances. His teenage daughter had been arrested on drug possession charges that were later dropped, but not before her college scholarship had been revoked. His elderly mother had been moved from her assisted living facility due to payment irregularities that had never been satisfactorily explained. "They don't just take your house," David Jim said, his hands shaking as he spoke. They destroy everything that matters to you until you have nothing left to fight with. That night, I hacked deeper into the HOA's financial systems, following money trails that led through a maze of shell companies and offshore accounts. What I discovered was a systematic operation targeting 78 properties throughout Pine Lake's community, each one strategically important for something called Operation Clearwater. The documentation was meticulous, laying out a timeline that would result in the acquisition of every significant piece of lakefront property within 5 years. The total budget allocated for this land grab was $50 million, funded through a complex partnership between Pinnacle Development and at least 6 other corporations whose names I recognized from major real estate development projects across 3 states. The most chilling discovery was a priority list that ranked every targeted property by strategic importance and estimated resistance level. My cabin sat at number 1, marked with a red flag, and the notation maximum resistance expected recommend. Accelerated timeline and enhanced personal pressure. Below that was a detailed psychological profile that analyzed my federal service background, my technical capabilities, and my emotional attachment vectors, which was their clinical way of describing how they planned to use Maria and my memories of my father to break my resistance. They'd been studying me 4 months, maybe years, planning exactly how to destroy my life if I didn't voluntarily surrender. At exactly midnight, my phone rang with a call that made my blood freeze. The voice was electronically distorted, processed through software designed to make identification impossible, but the message was crystal clear. David, Mitchell, you have 18 hours to sign the transfer documents, or Maria Thompson will experience a second accident. This time, she won't be as fortunate as she was with the traffic lights. The line went dead, leaving me staring at a phone screen that showed the call had originated from a number that didn't exist in any database I could access. But they'd made another mistake. The background noise in their call included sounds I recognized from my surveillance work. The subtle electronic hum that indicated they were calling from somewhere inside Pine Lake's community itself. Wilson and his organization had fundamentally misunderstood the man they were trying to intimidate. And tomorrow, they would discover what happened when you threatened the family of someone who knew how to turn their own weapons against them. Wilson's 18-hour ultimatum was ticking down, but I had advantages he didn't know about. In the cabin's basement, I activated what I called my war room, a setup I'd originally built for consulting work, but now repurposed for something far more serious. Multiple monitors displayed network traffic from across Pine Lake's community, while secure servers ran analysis programs I developed during my NSA days. Every digital footprint left by Wilson's organization was about to become evidence in a case they didn't even know I was building. My first discovery changed everything I thought I knew about the scope of this conspiracy. While analyzing the HOA's financial systems, I found evidence that they hadn't just stolen the $127,000 I'd already tracked. Over the past 18 months, they'd systematically looted $1.22 million from community funds through 15 different fake maintenance contracts. Companies that existed only on paper had built Pine Lakes for landscaping work that was never performed, security services that were never provided, and infrastructure upgrades that were never installed. The money had been laundered through a sophisticated network of shell companies before disappearing into offshore accounts that would require federal subpoenas to access. But the real breakthrough came when I discovered a backdoor hidden deep within the network infrastructure I designed. 15 years ago, someone with serious technical skills had inserted unauthorized access points into the system, creating a shadow network that allowed them to monitor and control everything from security cameras to traffic lights to emergency services dispatch. The coding signature was professional grade, the kind of work done by people with government-level clearances and unlimited budgets. This wasn't just about stealing money from HOA accounts. Someone was running a comprehensive surveillance and control operation, using the very systems I'd built to protect this community. The 911 system infiltration was the most disturbing discovery of all. I traced connection logs showing that Linda Hayes, the primary dispatcher for our county's emergency services, had been receiving detailed instructions about how to handle calls from Pine Lakes community. 3 residents had died in the past 6 months from delayed emergency responses, deaths that had been attributed to system overload and communication errors. But the logs showed deliberate delays and misdirected ambulances coordinated through the same shadow network that controlled the HOA's surveillance cameras. They weren't just stealing money and property. They were literally playing with people's lives. I needed legitimate authority for what I was planning. So, I reached out to Marcus Williams with a request that would either make him my most valuable Ollie or convince him I'd lost my mind. Marcus, I need you to help me get an emergency diagnostic warrant from Pine Lakes Utilities Authority. I can prove that someone has compromised critical infrastructure, but I need legal cover to access the systems without being charged with hacking. There was a long pause before Marcus responded. David, what you're describing sounds like a federal case. If you're right about the scope of this operation, we're going toned more than local authority. But he agreed to help, understanding that sometimes you have to bend rules to prevent worse crimes from being committed. While waiting for the warrant, I implemented the first phase of my psychological warfare campaign. I created a fake email thread suggesting that I was planning to flee the country with my Bitcoin assets, complete with fabricated flight reservations and overseas banking information. Then I deliberately allowed this information to be discovered through the HOA's surveillance network, knowing that Wilson and his people would intercept and analyze every detail. The goal was to make them believe they'd won, that I was running scared and preparing to abandon the cabin rather than face their threats. But the real purpose was to get them to reveal more of their capabilities and organizational structure while they celebrated their apparent victory. The fake escape plan worked better than I'd hoped. Within hours of planting the false information, I detected increased surveillance activity around the cabin and intercepted communications between Rachel Morrison and her mysterious Miss K handler. The conversations revealed details about their operational timeline, backup plans for acquiring my property after I'd fled, and most importantly, confirmation that tomorrow night they were planning a community meeting to discuss new security measures that would give them legal cover for expanded surveillance powers. They were moving faster than their original timeline, which meant I'd successfully pressured them into making mistakes. But my biggest psychological victory came when I discovered that Wilson's people had sabotaged my backup power system and blocked the emergency exit tunnel I'd built beneath the cabin. They thought they were trapping me, but their interference actually proved something crucial about their operational methods. They had detailed architectural knowledge of my property, access to utility company records, and the technical expertise to disable sophisticated security systems. This wasn't some local corruption scheme. I was dealing with an organization that had resources comparable to federal agencies, which meant the stakes were far higher than just my lakeside cabin. As midnight approached and Wilson's ultimatum deadline drew closer, my phone rang with a number I'd been expecting. Marcus Williams had come through with the emergency diagnostic warrant, giving me 24 hours of legitimate authority to access any system connected to Pine Lakes community infrastructure. David, he said quietly, I don't know what you're planning, but the FBI task force I'm working with is very interested in your findings. Whatever happens, tomorrow make sure you document everything according to federal evidence standards. The hunt was about to begin, and this time I had the law on my side. Wilson's people had surrounded my cabin with 3 black SUVs, but they'd made a tactical error that revealed more about their operational mindset than they realized. The vehicles were positioned to block the main road, the lakeside path, and the forest trail. But they deliberately left the dock area unguarded. They wanted me to attempt an escape by water, probably so they could claim I drowned in some tragic boating accident. But their surveillance focus on the lake meant they weren't monitoring my real activity. The digital infiltration I was conducting. from the cabin's basement using my newly authorized diagnostic warrant. What I discovered in Pinnacle development servers changed everything I thought I knew about this conspiracy. The CEO's private email archives contained detailed communications about something called Project Lakeshore Renaissance, and the scope was staggering. This wasn't just about Pine Lake's community or even the immediate region. Pinnacle was coordinating with 12 different development corporations to systematically acquire lakefront properties across 7 states using HOA manipulation as their primary weapon. The total estimated value of targeted land was $240 million, enough to build an integrated network of luxury resorts and casinos that would fundamentally transform the entire Great Lakes tourism industry. The mastermind behind this operation wasn't Wilson or even Rachel Morrison. It was someone identified in the encrypted communications as Catherine Kate Morrison, the mayor of our city, and Rachel's older sister. Kate had been using her political position to coordinate zoning changes, utility access modifications, and legal framework adjustments that would make the mass property acquisitions not just possible, but profitable beyond imagination. The emails showed her directing Rachel's HOA activities with military precision, timing each foreclosure to coincide with municipal policy changes that would maximize development potential for the seized properties. But the personal revelation that hit me hardest was buried in a folder marked Legacy Obstacles. 3 years ago, I'd sent an email warning to Rachel about the dangers of exploiting community members, a message I'd intended as friendly advice from someone with experience in investigating financial crimes. That email had been forwarded to Kate Morrison within hours, along with a comprehensive background check on my federal service record and a psychological assessment that labeled me as the primary threat to operational security. They'd been planning to eliminate me for 3 full years, and my father's death hadn't been random retaliation for his stubbornness. It had been a calculated step in a long-term strategy to remove the Mitchell family from Pine Lake's community permanently. The scope of surveillance they deployed against me was breathtaking. They had detailed records of my daily routines, my professional contacts, my financial transactions, and even my conversations with Maria. But the most chilling file was labeled Asset Thompson, and it contained intelligence reports on my wife that read like a military dossier. Maria's work schedule, her route home from the hospital, her medical training, and her potential value as leverage against me. The traffic light malfunction hadn't been a warning. It had been a field test of their ability to create accidents that would look natural to investigators but serve as precise psychological pressure against their targets. Just as I was processing the magnitude of their surveillance operation, my phone rang with a call that shattered my understanding of everything that had happened over the past week. The voice was familiar, warm, and impossible. David, son, I think. It's time we had a real conversation. It was my father, Robert Mitchell, speaking to me through a secure video connection that showed him sitting in what looked like a federal safe house. He was older, grayer, but unmistakably alive. I know this is a shock, but I need you to listen carefully. I've been working undercover for the FBI for the past 5 years, and everything that's happened to you was designed to draw Kate Morrison's organization into the open. My father explained that his death had been an elaborate federal operation designed to infiltrate Pinnacle development from within. The FBI had suspected the company of using HOA networks for large-scale money laundering and property fraud, but they'd needed someone with the technical background to understand the digital infrastructure being exploited. Dad had volunteered for what the Bureau called deep-cover civilian operations, allowing them to stage his death while he assumed a new identity within Pinnacle's organizational structure. Son, I hated letting you believe I was gone, but we needed Kate Morrison to think she'd eliminated the biggest obstacle to taking your cabin. It was the only way to get close enough to document their entire operation, but even my father's revelation pad, in comparison to the final twist that Marcus Williams delivered through an encrypted message. Maria wasn't just a trauma surgeon who'd happened to marry an ex-federal agent. She was an active FBI field agent who'd been assigned to monitor and protect me for the past 3 years. Ever since the Bureau had identified me as a potential target of Kate Morrison's organization, her medical career was real, but her presence in my life had been carefully orchestrated to ensure that someone with law enforcement training would be positioned to respond when Pinnacle finally moved against me. David Marcus explained in his message, "Maria volunteered for this assignment because she believed in the mission, but somewhere along the way, her feelings became genuine. The woman you married loves you, but she's also been protecting you from threats you didn't even know existed." The weight of these revelations was overwhelming, but they also provided the final pieces of evidence I needed to understand Kate Morrison's ultimate goal. Pine Lake's community wasn't just one target among many. It was the centerpiece of a development project that would require the displacement of 89,000 families across 7 states over the next decade. The profits would be enormous, but the human cost would be devastating for communities that had existed for generations. Kate Morrison wasn't just stealing property. She was engineering the largest forced relocation of American families since the urban renewal projects of the 1162nd, using legal manipulation and systematic intimidation to avoid the public scrutiny that traditional eminent domain would attract. As I sat in the darkness of my father's workshop, processing the fact that both my wife and my supposedly dead father were federal agents, my phone buzzed with one final message that crystallized everything I'd learned. It was from Governor Patricia Kellerman, a woman I'd never met, but who apparently knew everything about my situation. "Mr. Mitchell, Kate Morrison has been using fabricated evidence to blackmail me into supporting her development projects. Tomorrow at 6 p.m., she's planning to activate eminent domain procedures that will give Pinnacle legal authority to seize your property and 47 others in Pine Lake's community. We need to stop her before she can implement the final phase of her operation. And you're the only person with the technical knowledge and legal authority to do it." The pieces were finally coming together, but the timeline was accelerating beyond what any of us had anticipated. Kate Morrison was making her final move, and I had less than 18 hours to coordinate with a father I'd thought was dead, a wife who was an undercover agent, and a governor who was being blackmailed by the same woman who'd ordered my family's destruction. The war for Pine Lake's community was about to begin, and the outcome would determine whether 89,000 American families would keep their home or lose everything to the most sophisticated property theft scheme in modern history. The coordination call with my father and Maria felt surreal, like planning a military operation with ghosts who'd suddenly returned to life. Dad was calling from his FBI safe house. Maria was speaking from a secure location at Sacred Heart Hospital, and I was sitting in the basement of a cabin that 3 different criminal organizations wanted to seize within the next 16 hours. "David," my father said, his voice carrying the authority I remembered from childhood but tempered with years of undercover work. "Operation Mirror Strike is our only chance to expose Kate Morrison's entire network before she can activate those eminent domain procedures. We have one opportunity to use the infrastructure you built against the people who've been exploiting it." Governor Kellerman joined the secure conference call with information that made the stakes even higher. She wasn't just being blackmailed by Kate Morrison. She was being threatened with fabricated evidence that would destroy her political career and potentially send her to federal prison on corruption charges she'd never committed. "The AI-generated videos are incredibly sophisticated," Kellerman explained, her voice tight with controlled anger. "They show me taking bribes from Pinnacle development executives in meetings that never happened, but the technology is so advanced that even forensic analysis has trouble proving they're fake. Kate Morrison has been using these videos to force my approval of zoning changes and development permits across 7 states. But the conversation took an unexpected turn when Maria revealed the true scope of her FBI assignment. She hadn't just been protecting me for 3 years. She'd been documenting Kate Morrison's organization from the inside, using her position at Sacred Heart Hospital to identify other victims of their accident program. David, there have been 47 suspicious deaths in the target communities over the past 5 years. Heart attacks, car accidents, drownings, and falls all happened to property owners who refused to sell to Pinnacle Development or their shell companies. Kate Morrison isn't just stealing land. She's been systematically murdering anyone who stands in her way. And she's been using medical professionals like me to cover up the evidence by controlling autopsy reports and death certificates. My father's plan for Operation Mirror Strike was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its potential impact. At exactly 7:30 p.m. during Kate Morrison's emergency community meeting, where she planned to announce the eminent domain procedures, I would implement a controlled power diagnostic that would temporarily shut down electricity to the Pine Lakes Community Center. The 7-minute blackout would be completely legal under my emergency diagnostic warrant. And during that time, we would broadcast Maria's documented evidence through the community's emergency alert system. Every television, radio, and mobile device in the area would receive simultaneous transmission of recordings that proved Kate Morrison's criminal conspiracy. The technical execution required precise timing and coordination between multiple federal agencies. The FCC had granted emergency broadcast authority that would override local media systems, while the FBI had obtained warrants to seize Kate Morrison's digital communications in real time as she attempted to coordinate damage control. My role was to ensure that Pine Lakes community's infrastructure would support the broadcast while preventing Kate Morrison's people from interfering with the evidence transmission. "Son," my father said with pride in his voice, "you built these systems to protect people, and tonight they're going to serve their original purpose." But Kate Morrison had prepared for the possibility of federal intervention, and her countermeasures were more sophisticated than we'd anticipated. As I began the preliminary system checks for Operation Mirror Strike, I discovered that she'd positioned federal-level technical specialists throughout Pine Lakes community. These weren't local HOA security guards or private contractors. They were people with government clearances and military-grade equipment who'd been tasked with protecting Kate Morrison's operation from exactly the kind of digital warfare I was planning to deploy against her. The real surprise came when Governor Kellerman revealed that she wasn't the helpless blackmail victim she'd initially appeared to be. For the past 6 months, she'd been working with a federal task force to document Kate Morrison's political corruption, allowing herself to appear compromised while actually gathering evidence of the broader conspiracy. "Mr. Mitchell, the reason I contacted you directly is that Kate Morrison accelerated her timeline after discovering that federal agents were investigating Pinnacle Development. Your cabin isn't just strategically important for her development project, it's her last opportunity to demonstrate control over federal law enforcement before her entire organization collapses." At 7:30 p.m. sharp, I initiated the controlled power diagnostic that would serve as the opening move of Operation Mirror Strike. The Pine Lakes Community Center went dark, along with every connected building in the neighborhood, but backup generators maintained power to essential systems, including the emergency broadcast network. Through the surveillance cameras I'd secretly activated, I watched Kate Morrison's reaction as her carefully planned community meeting dissolved into confusion and panic. She immediately began issuing orders through her secure communication system, not realizing that every encrypted message was being intercepted and decoded by federal investigators who'd been waiting months for exactly this opportunity. The 7-minute broadcast that followed was devastating to Kate Morrison's criminal enterprise. Maria's evidence files showed detailed documentation of suspicious deaths, falsified medical records, and coordinated efforts to conceal murder evidence across multiple states. My father's undercover recordings revealed Kate Morrison personally ordering the elimination of property owners who refused to cooperate with Pinnacle Development's acquisition demands. The financial analysis I'd conducted showed the money-laundering network that had stolen millions of dollars from HOA communities to fund the broader conspiracy. Governor Kellerman provided recordings of Kate Morrison attempting to blackmail state officials into supporting illegal development projects. When the lights came back on, Kate Morrison found herself surrounded not by community members listening to her development presentation, but by 47 families who just learned that their HOA president had been systematically murdering their neighbors to steal their property. Outside the community center, FBI agents, state police, and IRS investigators were arresting Pinnacle Development executives, HOA board members, and municipal officials who'd been coordinating the largest property theft conspiracy in American history. Media crews that Kate Morrison had planned to use for positive publicity about her development project instead broadcast her arrest to television audiences across 3 time zones. The final moment of Kate Morrison's downfall came when she attempted to claim diplomatic immunity based on her political position as mayor. But I had prepared for this possibility by uploading every piece of evidence to an immutable blockchain storage system that created permanent tamper-proof records of her criminal activities. As federal agents placed handcuffs on the woman who'd ordered my father's fake death and planned my own elimination, she looked directly at me with pure hatred. "And here he is. David Mitchell," she said loudly enough for the news cameras to record. "You think you've won, but Pinnacle Development has resources you can't even imagine. This isn't over." But her threat rang hollow because Operation Mirror Strike had accomplished something far beyond stopping Kate Morrison's individual criminal enterprise. The evidence we broadcast had triggered federal investigations in all 7 target states, leading to the arrest of dozens of corrupt officials and the exposure of property theft schemes that had affected nearly 90,000 families. The blockchain evidence system I'd created was already being adopted by other communities as a defense against similar HOA manipulation tactics. Kate Morrison's conspiracy had been destroyed so completely that even her political allies were abandoning her to avoid being implicated in her crimes. As I stood in the parking lot of the Pine Lakes Community Center, watching FBI agents load Kate Morrison into a federal transport vehicle, my phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. "Congratulations on winning your first battle, Mr. Mitchell. But Pinnacle Development operates in 47 states and has $50 billion in development capital. We'll see you again very soon." The message reminded me that even total victory against Kate Morrison's organization might be just the beginning of a much larger war against systematic property theft in America. 6 months after Kate Morrison's arrest, the transformation of Pine Lakes community was remarkable. The woman who terrorized our neighborhood for years was serving a 25-year federal sentence without possibility of parole. Convicted on 47 counts of conspiracy to commit murder, racketeering, and organized property theft, Rachel Morrison received 20 years for her role as Kate's operational coordinator, while 12 other HOA board members across 7 states were serving sentences ranging from 5 to 15 years. The CEO of Pinnacle Development got 30 years for directing what federal prosecutors called the most sophisticated property theft conspiracy in American history. The financial recovery was staggering in its scope. $240 million in stolen assets were returned to affected communities, with 89,000 families receiving compensation, averaging $50,000 each for the trauma and financial losses they'd suffered. Jim Patterson bought back his family's cabin at fair market value and started a nonprofit organization to help other HOA victims navigate legal recovery processes. The Pine Lakes community established a new homeowners association with transparent bylaws, elected leadership, and strict financial oversight that would prevent future corruption. But the systemic changes were even more significant than the individual recoveries. Governor Kellerman signed the Mitchell-Williams Community Protection Act, a landmark legislation that prohibited HOA organizations from imposing fine-sex seating, actual costs, required independent auditing of community funds, and established criminal penalties for HOA officials who abuse their authority. 8 other states adopted similar laws within 6 months. creating legal protections for millions of homeowners who'd previously been vulnerable to the kind of exploitation we'd experienced in Pine Lakes. My father's return from the dead, so to speak, brought our family back together in ways I'd never thought possible. Robert Mitchell officially retired from FBI undercover work and moved into the cabin's guest house, spending his days helping me restore the workshop, where he'd supposedly died 5 years earlier. Maria revealed that her FBI assignment had ended the day Kate Morrison was arrested, but she'd chosen to continue working as a trauma surgeon while also serving as a consulting expert for federal investigations into HOA corruption. David. She told me one evening as we watched the sunset from our dock, "I may have been assigned to protect you initially, but falling in love with you was the most real thing that ever happened to me during those undercover years." The personal testimonies from our neighbors added emotional weight to the legal victory we'd achieved. Jim Patterson spoke at Kate Morrison's sentencing hearing, describing how her conspiracy had destroyed his family's financial security and nearly cost him his marriage. Eleanor Walsh, a 73-year-old widow who'd been targeted for foreclosure, told federal investigators that seeing Kate Morrison arrested on live television was the first time in 5 years I felt safe in my own home. 8-year-old Tommy Rodriguez drew pictures of our community celebration and sent them to me with a note that said, "Mr. Mitchell saved our houses, and now the bad lady can't hurt anyone else." The technology platform I developed during our fight against Kate Morrison evolved into something far beyond personal revenge. The Community Defense Network became a digital resource used by homeowner associations across 47 states, providing encryption tools, evidence documentation systems, and secure communication. Platforms that helped residents organize against corrupt leadership. The blockchain evidence storage system I'd created was adopted by federal law enforcement agencies as a standard tool for investigating financial crimes. What had started as one man's desperate attempt to save his family's cabin had become a national movement for community empowerment and transparency. But the story's most satisfying twist came through an encrypted message from the Canadian Federal Police. They'd been investigating a property development scheme in Toronto and Vancouver that bore striking similarities to Kate Morrison's operations, affecting more than 50,000 families across 2 provinces. The investigation had stalled until they discovered connections to former Pinnacle Development executives who'd fled to Canada after our successful operation. Mr. Mitchell. The message read, "We'd like to invite you to lead the international community Defense Task Force, a joint initiative between the United States and Canada to combat cross-border property theft conspiracies. The position comes with a $10 million budget and full diplomatic support from both governments." As I sat in my father's restored workshop, looking out at the lake that had been my family's sanctuary for 3 generations, I realized that our victory over Kate Morrison was just the beginning of something much larger. The cabin my grandfather had built by hand in 1952 had become the headquarters for HOA movement that was protecting communities across 2 nations. The infrastructure I designed to serve one small lakeside neighborhood was now defending hundreds of thousands of families from systematic exploitation by criminal organizations with seemingly unlimited resources. Maria found me there as darkness fell over Pine Lake's community, bringing 2 cups of coffee and the comfortable silence that had defined our relationship long before I'd known she was an FBI agent. "So," she said with the smile that had captured my heart during those first months when I'd thought she was just a trauma surgeon who'd chosen to love a complicated man. "Are we really going to take on international property crime conspiracies?" I looked at the laptop screen showing 2,847,392 active members in the Community Defense Network across 67 countries and typed my first message as the new International Task Force Director Toronto Vancouver were coming. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I just paid that $250,000 fine and walked away from my family's cabin. Would Kate Morrison still be destroying communities? Would those 47 families still be living in fear? The truth is, we all have more power than we realize when we choose to stand up for what's right. If this story resonated with you, if it reminded you that ordinary people can defeat corruption when we work together, please hit that like button and subscribe to Happer Stories. There are thousands of communities out there fighting their own battles against injustice.